The boy had not eaten in 2 days when he heard the three men mention the name of the only man on earth who had ever been kind to him. His name was Caleb, Caleb Renner. He was 10 years old, though the clothes he wore looked like they belonged to a boy of 6. He had a thin face. He had bruised ankles. He had eyes the color of wet slate, and those eyes had learned years ago how to look at the ground when a grown man walked past. It was 18 minutes before 10 in the morning on the outskirts of Las Vegas, where the neon died and the desert began. Caleb sat with his back pressed against the warm metal of an industrial dumpster tucked into a sliver of shade behind an abandoned tire shop. He was eating the crust of a ham sandwich he had pulled from a paper bag somebody had left on top of the dumpster an hour before. He was chewing slowly. He always chewed slowly. His mother had taught him that food lasts longer when you respect it. His mother. 2 years dead. She had died in a room above a laundromat in Henderson, coughing into a pillowcase, whispering to him through the fever that he must never take off the small leather pouch she had tied around his neck. He reached up and touched it now. It was still there, still warm against his skin, still heavy with something he had never opened. He was halfway through the last bite of crust when the voices came. 3 of them. Low, clipped. Men who were used to not being overheard. They had stopped on the other side of a stack of rusted shipping containers not 6 feet from where Caleb sat. If he had breathed louder, they would have heard him. But Caleb had learned the way a deer learns that the world is safer when you are small and silent. He did not move. He did not lift his head. He did not even finish chewing. He let the bread dissolve on his tongue and he listened. The first voice was dry like a man who smoked too much and slept too little. He said a time, 10 o'clock. He said the name of the gas station. The Sinclair on the edge of the highway where the old road met the new one. He said the man they were waiting for always stopped there for fuel before he rode out to the clubhouse. The second voice was younger, tighter, the voice of a man trying too hard to sound calm. He asked whether the target could reach his piece while holding the pump. The first voice said no. That was the whole point. A man with a gas nozzle in one hand is a man with only one hand. The third voice, the leader, spoke last. He had a slow way of talking like gravel being poured into a bucket. He said they would drop him. Take his vest. Be gone before the first siren. Then he said the name, Tanner. Caleb stopped breathing. He knew that name the way a stray dog knows the name of the one person in the neighborhood who had ever set out a bowl of water. 3 months earlier, in a 24-hour convenience store on the north side of town, Caleb had been standing in front of a rack of protein bars. He had not been trying to steal. He had been trying to remember what it felt like to eat something that was still inside its wrapper. A shadow had fallen over him, a shadow the size of a refrigerator. Caleb had looked up and up and up and seen a man with a gray beard that reached the middle of his chest, a black leather vest, patched with symbols that Caleb did not understand, and 2 hands that looked like they had been carved out of hickory wood. The man had not spoken to him. He had picked up 2 protein bars, he had carried them to the register, he had paid, he had walked outside, and then he had turned around, leaned back through the open door and tossed both bars underhand across the aisle where they landed softly at Caleb's bare feet. The man had looked at him just once with eyes that were pale and tired and carried a long old private hurt, and he had said only one thing. Eat up, kid. The desert eats the weak. Then he had walked out, swung a leg over a blacked-out Harley, and thundered off into the night. Caleb had eaten both bars before he had moved from that spot. Later, in the shadow of the laundromat where he slept, he had asked an old woman who lived in a cardboard box next to his who that man was. The old woman had crossed herself. She had said the man's road name and then his real name, and then she had said, "Do not ever ask about him again, child, because men like him do not have friends, they only have brothers, and you are not one." Roy Tanner, Bone Crusher, Sergeant at Arms. That was the name the three men in the alley had just spoken. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, in less than 12 minutes now, they were going to kill him. Caleb stayed motionless for what felt like a very long time. The sun was climbing. The shade was shrinking. He could feel sweat running down the back of his neck, pooling in the hollow of his collarbone, which stuck out through the neck of his oversized shirt the way a chicken bone sticks through wet paper. He thought about his mother. His mother had taught him many things in the 3 years before she got sick. She had taught him how to memorize a string of names the way other children memorize nursery rhymes. She had taught him how to fold a newspaper so that a newspaper could keep a boy warm. She had taught him how to disappear in a crowd. She had taught him that the world was full of men who would hurt him for the price of a sandwich. But she had also taught him one last thing. The last thing she ever taught him. She had taught it to him on the night she died, when her hand was already cold, and her voice was already far away. She had said, "Caleb, listen to me. In this life there are only a few people who will ever see you. Most will look right through you. But the ones who see you, the ones who feed you when they do not have to, those are the ones you owe. You owe them everything, do you understand?" He had nodded. He had not understood. He had been 8. He understood now. He turned his head just a fraction, just enough to see through a gap between two of the shipping containers. He saw the men, 3 of them, dressed in dark shirts and work jeans. One of them was checking the slide on a pistol with a long black tube on the end of the barrel. Caleb did not know the word suppressor. He only knew the shape, and he knew the shape meant quiet. He looked past them out toward the lot. He saw the black van, engine running, driver behind the wheel, backed into a space where it could see both exits. He looked back at the leader, the man with the gravel voice. The man had a twitch in one eye, a scar through the eyebrow, a face Caleb would remember for the rest of his life. Caleb closed his eyes. He thought about 2 protein bars landing softly on dirty concrete at the feet of a boy nobody had ever chosen to see. And he decided. He moved. He moved the way his mother had taught him to move. Low, quick, staying along the base of the wall where the shadow was deepest. He slipped around the back of the tire shop. He crossed the broken asphalt of a side alley. His bare feet made almost no sound on the hot ground. The Sinclair sat 70 yards ahead. Its old white and green sign was faded and crooked. The canopy over the pumps was sun-bleached. A single attendant was inside the store watching a small television, not looking out. The air smelled of diesel and creosote. Caleb slowed. He ducked behind a concrete pillar at the corner of the lot. He scanned, and then he heard it. The engine. He felt it in his chest first, a deep rolling thunder, before he heard it with his ears. It was a sound that did not belong to the modern world. It was a sound out of an older, harder time. A V-twin engine in no particular hurry coming down the frontage road. A moment later the bike rolled into the station. The man on it was enormous. Gray in the beard, yes, but thicker through the chest than any man Caleb had ever seen. His hands on the grips looked like tools. His vest was old leather, darkened at the shoulders where decades of weather had lived. On his forearm, Caleb could see even from this distance a single tattoo in block letters. Joel, the man killed the engine. The silence that followed felt somehow louder than the engine had been. Roy Tanner kicked down the stand. He swung a heavy boot to the pavement. He pulled off his riding gloves slowly, finger by finger. He looked tired. His eyes were not on his surroundings. His eyes were on nothing at all. His mind was far away. Maybe on a highway. Maybe on a clubhouse meeting. Maybe on the name inked into his own skin. He reached for the fuel nozzle. Caleb saw in that same moment two things that Roy did not see. He saw a gloved hand ease out from behind the ice machine at the front of the store, and he saw through the tinted windshield of the black van the driver lower his head and put the vehicle into gear. There was no more time. Caleb ran. He did not run toward the pumps. He was a small boy. A small boy running at a biker was a thing a biker's instincts would meet with violence. His mother had taught him that too. Men who have been hunted their whole lives flinch first and think second. So Caleb circled. He came up behind the Harley low, his hands up. He moved fast, but he made small sounds. He made the kind of scuffing sound a rat might make behind a dumpster, a sound Roy's ears would register as nothing dangerous. Roy's hand even so dropped an inch toward his hip. Caleb reached him. He did not grab the man. He grabbed the leather of the vest. Not high, not at the collar, low at the back where it hung loose. He pulled just once, hard enough to tug the big man a half step off balance. Roy turned. Those pale, tired eyes looked down, and Caleb on his tiptoes, his lips almost against the older man's ear, whispered 7 words. It's a setup. Run. They're waiting. Roy did not move. For one long, terrible second, Roy Tanner did not move at all. Caleb saw his own small shape reflected in the lens of the man's sunglasses. He saw how thin he looked, how dirty, how young. He wondered if he had just wasted his last chance on a man who was about to shove him away. Then Roy's eyes narrowed, not in anger, in focus, in something colder and older than anger. Roy's gaze lifted past Caleb over the top of his small head toward the ice machine, and in the tiny polished stainless steel edge where the machine met the canopy support Roy saw the glint, the curve of a shoulder, the shine of a pistol slide where it caught a slice of morning sun. Roy moved. He moved the way the mountain moves in an earthquake. No warning, no wind up. Just sudden, committed, total force. His left arm scooped Caleb off the pavement and tucked the boy against his body as if Caleb weighed nothing. His right hand shoved the Harley sideways, using the weight of the bike as a shield, and he dove behind the concrete pillar. A spray of compressed air hissed through the morning. Pfft, pfft, pfft. The side mirror of the Harley exploded into a cloud of silver fragments. A round struck the concrete pillar exactly where the back of Roy's head had been standing half a second earlier, and a chunk of gray dust burst out of the column. Caleb did not scream. He had not screamed in years. He only curled smaller against the wall of muscle and leather that was now wrapped around him, and he closed his eyes. Stay down. Roy's voice was low at his ear. Low and steady. the voice of a man who had been in rooms like this before. Stay down, kid. You do not move. You do not look. You breathe. Caleb breathed. From behind the ice machine, the two gunmen stepped out. They had lost the element of surprise. Now they were committed. Their silenced pistols coughed again, and the pillar chipped and spat concrete all around Roy's shoulder. Roy reached inside his vest. He did not pull out a little gun. He pulled out a hand cannon, a .45 with wooden grips worn smooth by years. He did not speak. He did not warn them. He leaned out 1 inch from the edge of the pillar, sighted once, and fired. The boom of the .45 was not a hiss. It was not a whisper. It was a sound like a door slamming in hell. It rolled across the gas station lot and bounced back off the old truck stop sign on the far side of the highway. One of the gunmen screamed and folded sideways, clutching his shoulder. The black van lurched forward. Roy saw it. Caleb felt it. Roy's arm tightened around him. The driver was not aiming for the pumps. He was aiming for the pillar. Roy rolled, dragging Caleb with him, putting his own enormous body between the boy and the oncoming grill. He came up on one knee, steadied his gun hand on the top of his own forearm, and fired 3 times into the windshield of the van. The glass spiderwebbed. A dark shape slumped behind the wheel. The van veered sharply left, jumped the concrete curb, and slammed into a stack of propane tanks at the side of the station. The tanks hissed and rattled. One of them ruptured with a sound like a dragon exhaling. In the confusion, the leader of the 3, the man with the scar through the eyebrow, broke from his cover and ran. He dragged his wounded partner with him. They crossed the lot in a staggering sprint, climbed into a battered pickup truck that had been waiting a block down, and were gone before the first distant wail of a siren touched the air. The gas station was quiet again. The propane was still hissing. The sign was swinging on one chain. The attendant was on the floor inside the store, hands over his head, face pressed into a pile of lottery tickets. Roy sat on the concrete with his back against the pillar. His chest was rising and falling. His big hand was still wrapped around Caleb. His gun was still in his other hand, but pointed down, now resting across his knee. He looked at the boy. Caleb looked back up at him. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Caleb's shirt was torn at the sleeve where Roy had grabbed him. There was a scrape on his cheek from the pavement. His leather pouch had swung out from under his collar and was lying against his breastbone over his heart. Roy's eyes dropped to the pouch, then back up to Caleb's face. Kid. Roy's voice was rough. What's your name? Caleb. Caleb what? Renner. Roy breathed in through his nose, slowly, out through his mouth, slowly. Caleb Renner, Roy said. How old are you? 10. Where do you live? Caleb did not answer. He looked down at the concrete, at his bare, bruised feet, at a dark spot on the pavement where one of the gunman's rounds had struck. Roy studied him. You live anywhere, Caleb. Caleb shook his head. Anyone know you're here? Caleb shook his head again. Who fed you last? Caleb looked up finally, and with a strange, flat, unchildlike calm, the kind of calm that is not peace, but only the exhaustion of a person who has stopped expecting anything from the world, he said, You did. Roy looked at him for a long moment. Something inside the big man's face shifted. Not on the surface, not visibly, but underneath. the way a riverbank shifts when the water has been working it for 40 years and one more night of rain is finally too much. Roy pulled out a cell phone. He did not call the police. He dialed a number from memory. Preacher, he said when the other line picked up. It's Roy. Sinclair off Highway 15. They made a run at me. 3 shooters silenced pistols plus a wheelman. 2 runners still breathing. I want the road swept before the locals tape off the lot. And I want a rider at the back of the shop in 4 minutes. We are riding out clean. A pause. And he said before he hung up, tell Lorene to set a place at the table. I am bringing somebody home. He ended the call. He slipped the phone back inside his vest, and with the same slow care he had used to pull off his riding gloves, he reached out, brushed the dirt off Caleb's shoulder, and helped the boy to his feet. Can you walk? He said. Yes. You can ride on a bike. I have never ridden on a bike. A very small, very tired muscle moved in Roy's cheek. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of one. Today you learn, he said. 2 minutes later, Roy Tanner, Sergeant at Arms for the Valley, chapter of the Hells Angels, with a boy no bigger than a sack of flour clinging to the back of his vest, kicked the Harley to life and rode out of the Sinclair lot just as the first red and blue lights crested the distant rise of the highway. They did not go home. They went northwest, off the main road, through an industrial stretch of warehouses and chain-link fences where the air smelled of motor oil and creosote. Caleb rode with his eyes closed for the first mile, then slowly he opened them. The world slid past him at a speed he had never felt before. The asphalt beneath was a gray river. The telephone poles were a picket line of time passing. The wind pulled the tears out of the corners of his eyes and sent them sideways across his temples into his hair. He had been afraid when Roy first said, "Climb on." Now he was not afraid. Now he was something else. Something he did not have a word for. He pressed his face against the back of Roy's leather vest. The leather smelled of old smoke, of oil of sweat, and of one other thing faint but present, a sharper smell like pine. Caleb realized it was a scent from a small pine tree air freshener hanging from Roy's keyring. A little green tree swinging, while the man who wore this leather carried guns and death and a name on his arm that he never spoke. Roy did not speak to him on the ride. He spoke only with his body. When Caleb's grip slipped once, Roy shifted his weight to anchor the boy against his back. When the wind picked up, Roy leaned into it a little more to block Caleb with his shoulders. Small, silent, reflexive kindnesses from a man whose whole life was supposed to be violence. They reached the clubhouse an hour after sunset. It sat inside a tall chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Floodlights washed the lot. A long, low brick building with blacked-out windows anchored one end. A row of bikes, maybe 30 of them, gleamed under the lights. At the gate stood a man with a shotgun across his chest. When he saw Roy, he hit a button and the heavy steel gate rolled open. Roy rode into the yard, killed the engine, and did not move. 24 men came out of the clubhouse at once. Caleb, still clinging to Roy's vest, felt his stomach drop. They were big. They were all big. They were leather and scars and beards and tattoos and eyes that had seen things. They did not run to Roy. They walked, deliberately, the way men walk when the news is serious. At the front was a tall man with silver hair pulled back into a tight braid, a cross stitched in white thread on the breast of his vest, and a face like a weathered mountain. The president, preacher, Roy, preacher said. And then his eyes dropped, and for the first time he saw the small boy in the too big shirt sitting on the back of the Harley still holding on. Preacher's expression did not change, but Caleb, who had learned to read men the way other boys learned to read books, saw that it did underneath. Roy dismounted. He reached back and lifted Caleb off the bike, set him down on the gravel as if he weighed less than a bag of groceries. "Preacher," Roy said, "meet Caleb Renner. He saved my life this morning." A murmur went through the circle of bikers. A few of them exchanged looks. A few of them looked at Caleb with frank surprised attention, the way you look at a sparrow that has just flown into your kitchen. One of them, a younger man leaner than the others, a man with a bleach blonde goatee and restless hands, did not look at Caleb with surprise. He looked with something else. Something Caleb, who had learned to read men, recognized right away. He looked at Caleb the way a wolf looks at a bird on the wrong side of the fence. His patch read Trent Braddock. Caleb looked down at the gravel. He kept his hands at his sides. He did not smile. He did not speak. He had learned a long time ago that children smile only for people who had not yet earned being smiled at. An older woman came out of the clubhouse, drying her hands on a dish towel. She was in her 60s, broad at the hips, gray at the temples, with arms that had hauled more beer kegs than most truck drivers. Laureen. She took one look at Caleb, and her expression did something Caleb had not seen on a grown woman's face in 2 years. It softened, and then it clouded, and then it hardened again, the way a face hardens when it has decided something. "Lord," she said quietly to no one in particular, "Lord, have mercy on the people who did this to you." She walked up to Roy. She put a hand on his arm. She looked up at him. Whatever she saw in his face made her nod once. She turned to Caleb. "Child," she said, "come with me. You are going to have a bath. You are going to have clean clothes. And then you are going to sit down at my table and you are going to eat. You do not have to talk. You do not have to smile. You only have to eat." Caleb did not move. He looked at Roy. Roy looked back. And the big man who had killed a driver behind a windshield 3 hours before knelt down slowly on the gravel. He did not reach for the boy. He did not try to hug him. He remembered from a long time ago that a frightened thing has to come to you on its own. He just lowered himself until his eyes were level with Caleb's, and he said quietly, "Go on, Caleb. Laureen is the boss in there. I will be here. I am not going anywhere tonight. You eat, you sleep. I will be here." Caleb looked into those pale, tired, old, hurt eyes. And for the first time since the night his mother had stopped breathing, Caleb did something that felt in its smallness enormous. He nodded. He walked with Laureen toward the clubhouse. At the door he stopped and he looked back. Roy was still kneeling in the gravel. Preacher was standing over him now, saying something low. The other bikers had formed a loose half-circle around them, and off to one side, leaning against the fender of a Ford pickup, was Trent Braddock, watching Caleb's small silhouette in the doorway with eyes that did not blink. Caleb turned and went inside. The inside of the clubhouse smelled of cigar smoke and old beer, and something else that Caleb's body recognized before his mind did. It smelled of beef stew simmering on a stove the way a grandmother's kitchen smells on a cold day. It was a smell Caleb had not smelled since his mother had been strong enough to cook. Laureen led him down a hallway past a big room with a pool table and walls covered in photographs of men, some of whom Caleb noticed in his memory-trained way had black ribbons taped across the corners of their frames. dead brothers. She led him into a small bathroom with a clawfoot tub. She turned on the hot water. She laid out a clean flannel shirt on the counter, a pair of boys' jeans not new but clean and folded, a pair of thick socks, a pair of worn but sturdy boots. She said, "I am going to step out. You wash twice. There is shampoo on the shelf. When you are done, you come to the kitchen. I will not look at you when you come in, so you do not have to feel watched. Do you understand me, child?" Caleb nodded. She reached out. She did not touch him. She just laid her palm gently against the doorframe near his shoulder as if she were touching the air around him instead. And then she walked out and closed the door. Caleb stood alone in the steaming room. Slowly he pulled off his shirt. Slowly he pulled the leather pouch up over his head and held it in both hands for a long moment. He laid it carefully on top of the folded flannel shirt. He took off the rest of his clothes, which barely qualified as clothes, and stepped into the hot water. When the heat touched his skin, his whole body began to shake. He did not know that the shaking was called grief. He sat in the tub until the water went pink around him from the dirt of 100 nights behind a dumpster, and then he sat longer, and then finally he began to wash. 20 minutes later, Caleb walked into the clubhouse kitchen in a flannel shirt that was still too big for him, but smelled of laundry detergent. His hair was wet and parted on the side. He had put the leather pouch back around his neck, and it rested warm from his bath against his collarbone. The kitchen had a long wooden table. At one end sat Roy. At the other empty was a place setting, a bowl, a spoon, a slice of buttered bread on a plate, a glass of milk. Lorene was at the stove, her back to the door, stirring a pot. She did not turn around when Caleb came in. She did not turn around when he pulled out the chair. She did not turn around when he sat down. Nobody watched him eat. Nobody reached for his plate. Nobody said anything. Caleb lifted the spoon. His hand was shaking. He dipped the spoon into the bowl of beef stew. He lifted it to his mouth. He put it in. He chewed. For the first time in 2 years, food stayed on the table until he was finished. Halfway through the bowl, Caleb stopped. He stared at the spoon. He stared at the wood grain of the table. Something was coming up inside him. Something he had held down for a very long time. He did not have a word for it. He only knew that if he did not let it come up, it was going to break him. At the far end of the table, Roy was quietly cleaning his hand cannon. He was not looking at Caleb. He was running a small cloth down the length of the barrel, slow, methodical, the way a man prays with a rosary. Without looking up, he spoke. "You do not have to talk, Caleb," he said. "You can just sit and eat. You can sit here as long as you want. Nobody in this room is going to rush you." Caleb sat very still. And then in a small, flat, utterly calm voice, the voice of a child who has stopped believing that words cost anything, he said, "My mother told me I owed you. Before she died. She said if somebody sees you when nobody else does, you owe them everything. That is why I ran today, because you gave me 2 bars of food and nobody else ever did." The cloth stopped moving in Roy's hand. At the stove, Lorene's shoulders went still. Caleb took another bite of stew. He did not cry. He did not look up. He did not wait for anyone to answer him. He ate. Roy set the cloth down on the table. He set the gun down next to it. He put both of his big hands flat on the wood. He did not say anything for a long time. Then finally, without looking at the boy, in a voice that was much quieter than the voice he had used all day, he said, "What did they call your mother, Caleb?" Marin, Caleb said. Marin Renner. The fork that Laureen had been using to turn something on the stove clattered onto the burner. She turned slowly and she looked across the kitchen at Roy. Roy looked back at her. Neither of them spoke. But Caleb, who had trained his whole life to notice small things, saw the look that passed between them. And in that look he saw something he did not understand. He saw something that was older than today, older than the Sinclair, older than the 2 protein bars. He saw 2 adults recognizing a name and not liking what that recognition meant. He took another bite of stew. Outside in the yard, the night wind pushed through the razor wire at the top of the chain-link fence and made a low whistling sound like a song somebody had been meaning to finish for a long time. And somewhere past the fence, out in the dark, beyond the reach of the floodlights, down a road that nobody in that clubhouse yet knew they were going to have to ride, 3 men in a battered pickup were making a telephone call to a very quiet man in a very expensive office and telling him that the boy had been found. The boy slept that night in a back room of the clubhouse on a cot that smelled of cedar and old wool. Laureen had folded a quilt over him twice because she said small bones get cold in ways grown bones do not remember. She had left the door cracked an inch. She had left a hallway light on. And in the hallway, without making any show of it, Roy Tanner had pulled up a folding chair, set it against the wall across from that cracked door, and sat down with his hand cannon across his thigh. He sat that way all night. He did not sleep. A little after midnight, the door to the clubhouse's back office opened. Preacher came down the hall in his sock feet. He stopped beside Roy and looked into the cracked room. Inside, the small lump on the cot shifted once, whimpered quietly, and then went still again. The boy's breath steadied. Preacher lowered his voice. You heard what he said. I heard it. Marin Renner. I heard it. Preacher exhaled slowly. He lowered himself down onto the floor beside Roy, his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Preacher said, That is a name I have not heard out loud in a long time, brother. I know. Bishop's girl. I know. Preacher rubbed a hand down his face. You remember the last time we saw her? Roy nodded once. His jaw worked. His jaw. She was 19. She came to the funeral wearing a black dress somebody had loaned her and shoes that did not match. She stood at the back of the cemetery. She would not come up to the graveside. When it was over, she turned around and she walked out the gate, and she never came back. 22 years ago, Preacher said. 22, Roy agreed. They sat in silence. And now her boy is in our kitchen, Preacher said. Yes. And somebody has been hunting him. Yes. Preacher looked at the cracked door, looked at the hallway light catching on the worn spots of the floorboards. Roy, he said finally, that child is not just a stray. I know it. That child is family. I know that too. Preacher turned his head. He looked at his sergeant at arms. He looked at the tattoo on Roy's forearm, at the 4-block letters that spelled Joel, and then he looked up at the man's face, which was doing something it had not done that Preacher had seen since the year Roy's own boy had gone into the ground. You good brother. Roy was quiet for a long time. I am not good. Preach, he said finally. But I am awake. For the first time in 19 years I am awake. Preacher put a hand on Roy's shoulder. He squeezed once. Then he stood up. Before he walked back down the hallway, he looked at the door one more time and he said, "We are going to find out who sent those 3 men. And we are going to find out why that boy was carrying that pouch. And then we are going to decide what we do about it." "All of it," Roy said. "All of it." Preacher agreed, and he was gone. Roy did not move from the folding chair until the first gray light of morning began to seep in through the clubhouse skylight and the boy in the cot inside began to stir. While the clubhouse slept and while the sergeant-at-arms kept watch, Lorene was not sleeping either. She was in the kitchen. She was washing the boy's clothes by hand in the big utility sink because the rags he had been wearing would have come apart in the machine. She had laid the small leather pouch on a folded dish towel on the counter because the boy had taken it off only for his bath and had asked her in his small flat voice, "Please do not lose it." She had promised him she would not. But she had not promised him she would not look at it. In the quiet of 4 in the morning, with Roy on his folding chair down the hall, and Preacher back in his office, Lorene sat down at the kitchen table under the single bulb, and she laid the leather pouch in front of her, and she looked at it. It was old, older than the boy. The leather had that deep dark patina that only comes from a decade or more of being worn against skin. The stitching was hand-done careful small. Somebody had made this by hand. Somebody had sat at a table and sewn every one of those little stitches and had meant them. She did not open the pouch. She had too much respect for Marin for that. But she did something else. She turned it over slowly and she ran her thumb along the seam at the bottom the way a woman who has sewn for 40 years runs her thumb along a seam. The seam at the bottom had been sewn twice. Once on the outside the way any pouch is sewn, but once more on the inside with a different thread, a newer thread. Somebody had opened the lining of this pouch and had sewn something into it and had sewn the lining back shut. Lorene stared at it for a long time. Then she got up, walked the pouch back down the hall past Roy without a word, and laid it gently on the small nightstand beside the boy's cot where he would find it when he woke. Some secrets, she thought, are not hers to open. Some secrets belong to the boy who is old enough to carry them, and to the man who is just old enough finally to help him. The next morning the clubhouse did what the clubhouse always did when something bad had happened. It ran like a fire station. By 7 o'clock 2 members had been dispatched to the Sinclair to watch who was showing up to ask questions. By 7:30 a third had been sent to Henderson to walk past the laundromat above which Marin had lived and died, and to see if anyone was posted outside. By 8, Preacher had called 3 different brothers at 3 different chapters along the state line and asked them to let him know if any unfamiliar trucks were moving through their territory. By 9, Roy was at the kitchen table with the boy. Lorene had put a plate of eggs in front of Caleb, plain, scrambled, with a piece of toast. She had not put too much on the plate because she had watched over the years how children who have known hunger can panic when you put a mountain of food in front of them. You feed them small and you feed them often and you do not watch them while they eat. Caleb sat across from Roy. He was eating in small, steady bites. He had not spoken since he had sat down. Roy took a sip from a heavy mug of black coffee. He set the mug down, and he said slowly so that his voice would be calm and quiet and easy for the boy to hear. "Caleb, I need to ask you about the pouch." Caleb kept chewing. He did not look up, but his free hand moved up and rested protectively against the leather at his collarbone. "Nobody is going to take it," Roy said. "Nobody in this room. Not me, not Lorene, Not anybody. That pouch is yours. Your mother gave it to you. I just need to know what she told you about it. Caleb chewed a little more slowly. After a moment, in that same small, flat voice, he said, "She told me never to take it off. She told me never to show anybody. She told me if anything ever happened to her, I was to keep moving until I found somebody safe, and then I was to give the pouch to them." "Did she tell you what was in it?" Caleb shook his head. "Did she ever open it in front of you?" Caleb shook his head again. "Did she ever say any names? About the pouch? About what was in it?" Caleb was quiet. He was looking at his eggs. He was holding very still, the way children hold still when they are about to say a thing they are not sure they are supposed to say. "She played a game with me," he said. "A game. Every night. Before she got sick. She made me sit on the floor of our apartment, and she sat on the couch, and she said, 'I have to teach you how to remember things.' She said, 'I have to teach you a game. Tell me about the game, Caleb.'" Caleb swallowed. His small hand was still touching the pouch. "She would read me a list, names, dates, addresses, numbers of cars. She would read it slow one time, and then she would put the paper away, and then she would ask me to say it back. If I got one wrong, we started over. If I got them all, she gave me a piece of chocolate." "How many things was she making you remember?" In the end, Caleb said 37. Roy went still. 37 names and dates. Yes. Could you still say them now? Caleb nodded slowly. I could still say them now. Roy and Lorene looked at each other across the kitchen. Roy leaned forward gently so that he was not a tall shadow over the boy, but something closer to his level. "Caleb," he said, "your mother was very smart." Caleb nodded. "And she was very scared." Caleb nodded again. Roy let out a long, slow breath. "Okay," he said. "We are going to go talk to Preacher. You and me. And when he asks you some questions, you can answer the ones you want to answer, and you can skip the ones you do not. And whenever you are tired, you tell me and we stop. Do we have a deal?" Caleb looked up at him, looked at those pale, tired, old, hurt eyes. "Okay," he said. In Preacher's office, the president listened while the 10-year-old boy recited in a soft, unshaking voice a list of 37 things his dead mother had made him memorize over and over on the floor of a rented apartment in Henderson, Nevada for 3 years. The list included names. The list included the names of shell companies. The list included addresses of warehouses along the border. The list included 2 street addresses inside Las Vegas city limits that Preacher recognized and that made his jaw tighten. The list included 1 name that belonged to a man who appeared on television news at least twice a month in a tailored suit. The list included the name of a county official whose face was on billboards along the highway. The list included the date of the boy's own mother's death, and beside it in the boy's small voice was a word Preacher had not been expecting. Poisoned. Preacher leaned back in his chair. He rubbed his hand slowly over his mouth. He looked at Roy. Roy did not look back. Roy was looking at the boy. Preacher said gently, "Caleb, your mother told you she was poisoned." Caleb nodded. "Did she say by who?" "She did not know a name," Caleb said. "She only knew who sent him." Who sent him, Caleb? Caleb was quiet. He looked at the pouch at his neck. After a long pause, he said, "A man who came to our house at night. A quiet man. She called him the one from the office. She said he brought her something to drink every week, and she pretended to drink it, and she poured it in the plant. But then the plant died, and she got scared, so she started to drink a little. And then after she drank a little, she got sick." Preacher closed his eyes. "Caleb," he said, and his voice was very gentle. "Do you remember what that man looked like?" Caleb looked up. "I remember what he looked like. I am going to show you some pictures. On the wall over there. Some pictures from the newspaper. You tell me if any of them are him. You do not have to be sure. You just have to tell me what you see. Can you do that?" Caleb slid down from the chair. He walked across the office and stood in front of the corkboard. On the corkboard were perhaps 20 clippings, county council stories, crime section clippings, photographs of local officials attending charity dinners, mug shots of men the club had reason to remember. Caleb looked slowly from face to face. His small hand came up. He pointed to a photograph on the third row. It was a picture from a fundraiser. A handsome man in his early 50s, gray at the temples, smiling at the camera with a champagne flute in his hand. He was standing next to a woman in a blue gown. The caption said he had personally pledged $50,000 to a shelter for at-risk youth. "That one," Caleb said. Roy went rigid. Preacher's jaw worked once. The photograph was of Emmett Vaughn, the district attorney of the county, the man the local paper had 2 years earlier named Citizen of the Year. Caleb stood in front of the corkboard, staring up at the photograph, and in the small, flat voice his mother had trained him to use when he was reciting, he said, "He came to our house 14 times. He wore a gray coat with a black collar. He brought a brown leather briefcase. He never stayed longer than 30 minutes. He called my mother Marin, and she called him Sir. He gave her a small brown bottle every time, and he took the old one away. The last time he came was 6 days before she died." The office was silent. The office was silent for what felt to Roy like a very long time. Then Preacher stood up. He walked around the desk. He knelt down, the way Roy had knelt down in the gravel the night before, until his eyes were level with the boys. "Caleb Renner," he said. "Yes, sir. You have been the strongest person in your house for a very long time, son." Caleb looked at him. "I know," he said. And Preacher, who had buried 14 brothers in his lifetime and had watched his own mother die slow in a hospital bed in Oakland, and had not cried at either, had to turn his face toward the wall for a moment before he stood back up. Nobody in that room in that moment said Vaughn's name out loud. Nobody had to. They all understood at the same time that a boy sleeping on a cot in a clubhouse back room was carrying inside his small skull a list of names that could cost a man in a tailored suit his entire life, and that the man in the tailored suit knew. That afternoon the clubhouse changed. It did not change loudly. It changed the way a house changes when it goes from waiting to working. 2 prospects were sent to install new motion cameras along the back fence. A brother named Moose, who had been a Navy signalman in the 90s, showed up with a hard case of radios. An older member named Grizzly, who in his former life had been an Army combat medic, started quietly laying out a field kit in the pantry in case anyone came home with holes in them. The clubhouse went into a posture Preacher had not ordered since 1996. Around 2 o'clock, Laureen walked into the kitchen and found Trent Braddock standing at the counter pouring himself a cup of coffee with the door to the back hallway slightly open and a view straight down the corridor to the room where Caleb was napping. Laureen did not say anything. She took her broom out of the corner. She swept slowly in front of Trent's feet until he had to step back. Then she swept again until he had to step back into the main room. Then she closed the door to the back hallway and set the broom against it. She did not look at him the whole time. Trent smiled at her. You got a problem with me, Laureen? I got no problem with anybody, child, Laureen said, still not looking at him. I just sweep where the dust gathers. And she walked out. Caleb saw none of that. Caleb was asleep. But Caleb, when he woke up an hour before sundown, did what a 10-year-old boy who has lived on the street learns to do before he has even learned to read. He listened before he moved. He heard through the cracked door of the back room the low voices of men in the main room. He heard Roy quiet calm. He heard Preacher calmer. And he heard a third voice, younger, higher, with an edge of argument in it. We should not be running a daycare, the third voice said. That kid is not our responsibility. That kid is heat. That kid is a target. You bring him under our roof and you put every patch here on the list. I am telling you, Preacher, for the good of the club. Sit down, Trent. I am sitting. I am just talking. Then talk less. Preacher's voice had gone flat. Flat the way a knife goes flat on a sharpening stone. You are a patch, brother. That buys you a seat at the table. It does not buy you a vote on whether this club feeds a child. Silence. Caleb lay very still on his cot, and he thought. He thought about the voice that had just been arguing. He thought about the voice that had been in the alley the previous morning. The second voice, the young, tight voice, the voice of a man trying too hard to sound calm. The voice that had said about the pump, can he reach his peace while he is holding the pump? He thought about those two voices. He lined them up in his head, and his small hands underneath the quilt began to shake. He waited until the voices outside died down. He waited until he heard through the cracked door the sound of Trent's boots heading out the front and the distant thud of the front door closing. He waited 5 minutes more. Then he got up. He went down the hallway in his sock feet. He walked silently until he came to the kitchen where Roy was sitting by himself at the long table turning his coffee mug slowly in his big hands. Roy looked up. He saw Caleb's face. He set the mug down. Caleb stood in the doorway, his small hand on the jamb. Uncle Roy, he said. It was the first time he had called him that. It had come out of him like a small bird that had been trapped in his throat for a long time. Roy did not move. Yes, Caleb. There is a fourth dog sleeping in this house. Roy's hand very slowly lowered itself to the .45 resting across his thigh. Tell me, son. Caleb took a breath. The man I just heard talking in the other room. The man who did not want me to stay. I have heard his voice before. Yesterday morning, behind the tire shop. He was the second man. He was the one who asked the leader if you could reach your gun while holding the pump. Roy became very still. You are sure, he said quietly. I remember voices, Caleb said. My mother taught me. Roy closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, there was something in them that had not been there the night before. There had been hurt in his eyes. There had been the ghost of something old. Now there was something else sitting alongside it. something that had a long, straight edge on it. He stood up. He walked to the doorway. He stopped beside Caleb, but he did not touch him. He only said in a voice that was for Caleb alone, "You are a brave boy." Then he walked past him into the main room. "Preacher," he said in a voice that the whole clubhouse heard, "we have a problem, and it is inside the fence." What Roy did not know, and what Caleb did not know, and what Preacher did not know yet either, was that 12 miles away, in a small cinder-block office behind an auto body shop, Trent Braddock was at that very minute on the phone. He was talking to a man named Dale Carver. Dale Carver had a scar through his eyebrow. And Dale Carver was saying into the phone in a slow gravel voice, "Tonight." By 9 o'clock that night, the inside of the clubhouse was on soft lockdown. Preacher had quietly moved Caleb out of the back room and up into Lorraine's apartment on the second floor above the kitchen, which had one staircase in and one fire escape out. He had Moose on the roof with a pair of binoculars. He had Grizzly at the front door with a shotgun. He had asked Trent very calmly to stay in the lounge by the pool table because he wanted to talk to him in a little while about some chapter business. Trent had smiled and said, "Sure, preach, no problem," and had sat down in a chair near the pool table with a beer. Preacher had not told Trent anything yet. Preacher wanted Trent right where he could see him. What Preacher had not counted on was how much Trent already knew, and how fast Trent's phone call had been. At 9:17 the front gate exploded. It did not open. It exploded. A lifted pickup truck with a steel push bar welded across the front came up the frontage road at 50 miles an hour and hit the gate dead center. The gate tore off its hinges. The guard in the gatehouse dove sideways. The pickup slewed into the yard and stopped crossways, its driver already rolling out of the cab with a rifle. Behind the pickup, 3 more trucks came in fast. Men were piling out of them before the wheels had stopped turning. 7, maybe 8, carrying long guns, wearing balaclavas, moving with a sharpness that said some of them had done this kind of work before for money. Inside the clubhouse, Preacher moved. He did not shout. He hit a switch under the bar which killed the lights in the main room and turned on a dim red work light at the staircase. He said in a low voice that carried, "Sierra, Sierra, Sierra." Every man in the room moved at once. Moose's voice crackled down from the roof on the handheld. 8 shooters. Preach. 2 at the front. 3 circling east. 3 coming up the right side along the fence, copy Preacher said. Roy was already up the stairs 3 at a time on his way to Lorraine's apartment. Inside that apartment, Caleb was sitting on the edge of Lorraine's worn floral couch, holding the pouch in both hands, his bare feet not quite touching the carpet. The first gunshot rang out downstairs. It was the heavy report of Grizzly's shotgun at the front door. The return fire came a second later, the snap of rifle rounds higher and tighter. Caleb flinched, but he did not cry. Roy came through the door. He closed it behind him. He pulled a heavy dresser from Lorraine's bedroom across the threshold with one arm. He turned. He looked at the boy. "Caleb," he said. The boy looked up at him. "Put your boots on, son. We are going." Caleb slid off the couch. He pulled on the boots Lorraine had given him. He tied them with hands that were steadier than any 10-year-old's hands should have been. Downstairs the firefight was ugly. 2 of the attackers got inside the front hallway. One took a round from Grizzly's shotgun in the hip and went down screaming. The other made it as far as the pool table before one of the prospects slammed a pool cue across the back of his skull. Then from near the pool table there was a different kind of noise, a shout, a crash, and a pistol shot that did not come from outside. It came from inside. Preacher, from his corner behind the bar, turned his head at the sound of that shot. Trent Braddock was standing up from his chair. Trent Braddock had a pistol in his hand. Trent Braddock had just shot the prospect in the leg and was now stepping over him, moving toward the staircase. Preacher raised his gun. Trent saw him. "Do not do it," Preacher Trent said. "You need me to walk up those stairs. You need the kid to walk out of here breathing, because if your boy Roy comes down those stairs with that kid in his arms, my people outside light up this whole building. I don't negotiate with dogs who eat out of my hand, Trent," Preacher said. And he fired. He put one round high on Trent's chest. Trent went down hard against the pool table and stayed there, one hand clutching his collarbone, his eyes wide. He was not dead. Preacher did not miss when he wanted someone dead. Upstairs, Roy heard the shot. He heard the yelling. He heard the crack of more rifle fire outside, and the heavy bass of Grizzly's shotgun answering. He heard the east wall of the building take a burst that tore through plaster and thudded into the studs. He picked up Caleb in one arm like a sack of flour the way he had picked him up off the pavement at the Sinclair, and he moved toward the fire escape window. Caleb did something then that Roy did not expect. He reached up. He put his small hand against the side of Roy's face and turned Roy's head toward him for 1 second. "Uncle Roy." "Yeah, son. If we do not get out," he said, "listen. There are 3 men. Dale Carver has the scar over his eyebrow. The second man has a tattoo of a snake on the back of his right hand. The driver of the van yesterday had a silver tooth on the left side of his mouth. Do you remember that?" Roy looked at him. He looked at those small slate gray eyes that had in 26 hours become the whole point of his life. "I remember it, son." Then Roy kicked the fire escape window open with the heel of his boot and carried Caleb out into the night. Behind them at the bottom of the stairs, Preacher was already on the radio, his voice flat and fast. "Colonel," he said. "Full call out. I need every patch you got on the road inside of 10 minutes. This is not a fight. This is a war. The package is moving north. Bone Crusher has the package. Light them up." From a long way off in Oakland, a phone rang once in a room full of men. A voice answered. A voice that had been a patch holder for 41 years. A voice that Preacher had ridden with once through a blizzard across the Sierra in 1998 to carry the body of a brother home. The voice said, "Tell my boy Preacher we are already on our bikes." And within 4 minutes, on a stretch of I-580 east of the Bay engines that had been quiet in garages and driveways all across Northern California began one after another to wake up. Roy and Caleb dropped down the fire escape into the alley behind the clubhouse. A sedan was parked there unmarked, a gift of Preacher's foresight. The keys were over the visor. Roy strapped Caleb into the passenger seat, put himself behind the wheel, and eased the sedan out of the alley into the desert night lights off running on the half moon. Behind them the clubhouse was a pattern of muzzle flashes in the dark. Caleb was looking out the back window. Roy was watching the mirror. 10 minutes out of town on a 2-lane highway heading up toward the foothills, Roy finally spoke. "Caleb," he said, "I am going to take you somewhere my father built. A long time ago. It is a place nobody knows about. We are going to be there by sunrise. You are going to be safe there." Caleb did not answer for a long moment. Then he said quietly, looking at the dark shapes of scrub and Joshua tree sliding past his window, Uncle Roy. Yes, son. The man in the tailored coat. Yes. He is not done with me. Roy glanced at the boy, at the small, steady shape in the passenger seat. I know, Caleb. Caleb put his hand over the pouch at his chest. He is going to come for me. He will send somebody in a nice suit. He will smile. He will say he is here to help. He will say the right things. And then he will kill me the way he killed my mother. Roy's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He is not going to get near you, Caleb. Caleb looked at him. Uncle Roy. Yes, son. You have a name on your arm. Roy did not answer for a moment. Yes, he said finally. I do. Who was he? Roy kept his eyes on the road, on the white line, on the 200 yards of asphalt the headlights were carving out of the dark. My son, he said. His name was Joel. He was 14. He died a long time ago. I was not there. Caleb considered that. He was quiet for almost a mile. Then he said, Were you supposed to be there? Roy's jaw moved. Yes, he said. I was supposed to be there. Caleb nodded slowly the way a very small adult nods. Uncle Roy, he said. Yes, son. You are here now. Roy did not look at him. He could not look at him. He kept his eyes on the white line and on the dark road and on the 200 yards of asphalt unrolling toward a place in the foothills of the Sierra where his own father 50 years ago had nailed up the rafters of a shop nobody had set foot in for almost 20 years. And behind them in the moonlight across the valley floor on every ridge between the city and the mountains, pairs of headlights were quietly, steadily coming to life. The shop was exactly where Roy had left it. It sat at the end of a dirt track 4 miles off the state highway, tucked against the shoulder of a pine ridge where the foothills began their slow climb toward the Sierra. A long, low building of weathered cedar and tin roofing with wide double doors that had been shut for the better part of 20 years. Behind the shop a creek ran most of the year. In front of it, an old gravel yard where Roy's father had once rebuilt 6 motorcycles at a time. The sun had not quite crested the ridge when Roy pulled the sedan up the last 100 yards of the track. Caleb was asleep in the passenger seat, his cheek against the cold glass of the window, his small hand still wrapped around the leather pouch at his chest. Roy killed the engine. He sat for a long moment watching the boy breathe. Then he got out quietly, closed the door with the soft click of a man who had once been someone's father, and walked up to the doors of the shop. The padlock on the doors was his father's. Roy still carried the key. He had been carrying it without thinking about it for 19 years. The lock came open with a small, hard sound. The doors swung back with a long, low groan of hinges that had not moved since 2 presidents ago. The air that came out of the shop smelled of cold metal and old oil and cedar dust and time. It smelled of a man Roy had loved and buried. It smelled of a boy Roy had loved and buried. It smelled like a room where grown men had once stood over a motorcycle at 2 in the morning, arguing about a carburetor. Roy stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he walked back to the sedan, opened the passenger door, lifted Caleb carefully into his arms, and carried the sleeping boy inside. He laid Caleb on an old army cot in the corner that his father had used for napping between jobs. He covered the boy with a wool blanket that smelled of pine. He stood over him, looking down for longer than he meant to. Then he walked back out into the gravel yard. In the distance from the direction of the highway, he could hear the very faint sound of engines. Not one, not two, many, rolling and steady, like a river far away. Roy smiled a very small smile. Preacher had sent them, and the colonel had come. They came up the dirt track in a long, ragged line, not charging, not loud, just steady, a column of headlights crawling up out of the low valley mist. At the head of the column, on an old black Harley with the paint worn down to the primer in places, rode the colonel. He was a lean, gray-headed man in his late 60s, his beard trimmed short and white, his eyes set deep under the brim of a half-helmet. When he had been young, he had been a tank commander in the army. When he had stopped being young, he had become something else. He had become the president of the Oakland Charter, and the man Preacher called only ever on the days when there was no other number left to call. The colonel rolled into the yard and killed his engine. Behind him, 52 bikes rolled in and killed theirs one by one, until the yard was full, and the only sound left was the creek down behind the shop running quietly over stones. Roy walked out to meet him. They did not embrace. They shook hands the way men who have known each other for 30 years shake hands when there is work to do. "Where is he?" the colonel asked. "Asleep. Inside." The colonel nodded. "Preacher briefed me on the road. Bishop's grandson." Roy looked at him. The colonel met his eye. "You did not know," the colonel said. "Any of it. I did not know any of it." The colonel looked up toward the tree line. "That boy in there, Roy. That boy is Marin's son. Marin was Bishop's girl. Bishop was your patched brother. That boy is blood to this table. Not figurative blood. Actual blood the way we count it, I know. Then we agree on what we are doing here. We agree." "Good," the colonel said, "because I did not ride over a mountain with 52 men to stand in a gravel yard and debate." Roy smiled a little. The colonel did not smile back. He was not built for it. He said, "We are set up as of this morning on both ends of the pass. Nothing comes up this dirt road that we do not see. Preacher is cleaning up the house back in the valley. Trent is in the barn at the clubhouse with 2 brothers standing over him. He is talking. He has given us Dale Carver and a network of names underneath him. Carver is the one you want, but Carver is not the one who matters," Von Roy said. "Vaughn," the colonel agreed, "the district attorney is the one who matters. But Vaughn is not the only one. There is somebody sitting above Vaughn, somebody who pays him. And that somebody, brother, is across a border we do not cross lightly." Roy looked at him. The colonel nodded once. "You are not fighting a gang anymore, Roy. You are fighting a cartel that has bought a county. The good news is we have the boy. The boy has the list. The list is the only thing that will finish this. The bad news is nobody can finish this for you. The kid has to be the one who testifies. The kid has to be the one who remembers." "Then the kid will remember," Roy said. "He is 10 years old, Roy. He is going to remember." The colonel looked at him for a long second. "You sound sure." "I am sure," Roy said. "Why?" "Because his mother trained him for this," Roy said. "She knew. She knew for 3 years that somebody was going to come for her. And she turned her own son into the witness they would never expect." The colonel was quiet. "That is a hell of a thing to do to a child," he said. "It kept him alive," Roy said. The colonel looked down at his hands. His old scarred tank commander hands. Roy, he said. Yes, you know how this ends. I know. You know that if that man in the tailored coat knows the boy is alive and the boy is talking, there is no box quiet enough in this country for that boy to ever sleep in without one of us in the doorway. I know. Then we better end this right. We will, Roy said. Behind them the door of the shop opened. Caleb stood in the doorway in the too big flannel shirt, the leather pouch still around his neck, his hair flat on one side from sleep. 52 bikers in a ragged crescent across the gravel yard turned and looked at him. Nobody said anything. The colonel stepped forward. He walked slowly until he was standing about 5 feet from the boy. He pulled off his half helmet. He went down on one knee the way Preacher had done, the way Roy had done, the way men of his generation did when they wanted a child to understand that they were not being towered over. Son, he said. Yes, sir, Caleb said. My name is not important. You can call me Colonel. I knew your grandfather, a long time ago. Caleb's hand came up slowly and touched the pouch. I did not know I had a grandfather, he said. I know you did not, son. Caleb looked down at the pouch in his fingers. After a moment he looked up, and in his small, steady voice he said, Was he a good man? The colonel held his gaze. He was a hard man, he said, but in the ways that matter to a boy, yes. He was a good man. He loved your mother. He would have loved you. Caleb nodded slowly. The colonel stood up. He turned toward the 52 men in the yard, and he said in a voice that did not rise but that carried, Brothers, this is Caleb Renner. This is Bishop Renner's grandson. As of this morning, he is under the protection of every chapter that flies our colors west of the Mississippi. Am I clear? Yes, the 52 men said. Am I clear? The colonel said again. Yes, the 52 men said again, and this time the word rolled across the yard like a low, slow wave. Caleb looked at all of them. At 52 strange, weather-beaten, heavily tattooed men, most of them over 50, many of them over 60, all of them looking at him with the steady, unsmiling attention of grown men who had just been handed something precious to carry. And Caleb Renner, who had not cried when his mother died, and had not cried when 3 men in an alley had said they were going to kill the only person in the world who had ever seen him, and had not cried when a firefight had torn through the clubhouse kitchen, the night before stood in the doorway of his dead grandfather's shop and began silently to cry. Roy walked over to him. He did not kneel this time. He stood beside the boy. He let his big, rough hand rest for the first time very gently on top of the boy's head. Caleb leaned his cheek once against the side of Roy's leg. And in the yard, out of respect, no man looked away, and no man looked at them. They looked at the tree line. They looked at the creek. They looked in silence at the morning. They stayed at the shop for 3 days. Preacher back in the valley had his own work. He had one of Trent's phones. He had names. He had the serial numbers of 2 of the rifles left behind in the clubhouse driveway. And he had sitting in a hardback chair in the little side office of a diner in Bakersfield that belonged to an old friend of the club, a very thin, very tired, very unsmiling reporter named Hollis Bream, who had been chasing Emmett Vaughn for 3 years without ever being able to prove anything. Hollis Bream drove out to the shop on the second morning up the dirt track in an old brown Volvo wagon alone. He had a notebook in his coat pocket. He had a small black cassette recorder on a strap around his neck. He had been a newspaper man for 41 years, and he had stopped being surprised by anything since the late 80s. Preacher had told him only one thing. The Vaughn story you have been chasing for 3 years is inside that shop. It is 10 years old. Ask it its name. Hollis Bream walked into the shop with his hat in his hand. Caleb sat on a workbench, his feet hanging above the floor. Hollis sat on a wooden crate across from him. "Son," he said. "My name is Hollis. I work for a newspaper. I write stories. I am not a policeman. I am not with the courts. I am not with the county. I do not talk to any of those people. I talk to readers. Would it be all right with you if I asked you some questions and wrote them down?" Caleb looked at Roy, who was standing at the far end of the workbench cleaning his hand cannon with a small cloth. Roy nodded. Caleb looked back at Hollis. "Yes, sir." Hollis pressed the red button on the cassette recorder. "Tell me," he said, "what your mother told you." And for 3 hours and 11 minutes on a reel of magnetic tape in a small black cassette recorder, a 10-year-old boy in an oversized flannel shirt, sitting on a workbench in a cedar shop at the edge of a national forest, calmly and steadily recited the memory game his mother had taught him, night after night on the floor of a rented apartment in Henderson, Nevada. 37 names. 14 addresses, 6 shell companies, 2 warehouses, a district attorney, a county supervisor, a judge. The dates and approximate times of 14 visits by a man in a gray coat with a black collar who brought a brown leather briefcase and a small brown bottle and called a tired woman by her first name and let her call him sir. And the boy said at the end in the same small, flat voice, "He killed her." Hollis Bream, who had not cried in public since his wife's funeral many years earlier, had to excuse himself and walk outside to the creek for 5 minutes before he could come back in and turn the tape over. When the interview was over, Hollis clicked the recorder off. He took the cassette out. He laid it on the workbench. He looked at Roy. "I will not print the boy's name," he said. "I know you won't," Roy said. "I will call him a minor witness. I will corroborate every name on this tape before I print a word. It will take me 10 days. 10 days is fine," Roy said. Hollis put his hat back on. He looked at Caleb one more time. "Son," he said, "I have been doing this job for a long time. There are things a man hears in this work that he carries the rest of his life. I am going to carry what I heard today. I want you to know that." Caleb looked at him. "Thank you, sir," he said, "for listening." Hollis Bream walked out of that shop and drove his brown Volvo back down the mountain with the cassette tape in a manila envelope on the passenger seat. On the way home, he stopped at 4 post offices in 4 different small towns and mailed 4 identical sealed envelopes, each containing a duplicate cassette he had made the night before on equipment his grandson had set up in his basement. The envelopes went to 4 post office boxes in 4 different states under 4 different names, each under the standing care of a different attorney who had been retained and paid 10 years earlier for exactly this kind of errand. If Hollis Bream disappeared, the envelopes opened. If the boy disappeared, the envelopes opened. If the shop burned down, the envelopes opened. Hollis was old. Hollis was tired. But Hollis had been a newspaper man for 41 years, and Hollis had always known in his bones that stories like this one had to be buried in more than one grave. On the 4th morning, a silver sedan came up the dirt track. The men in the yard put their hands on their sidearms but did not draw. The sedan stopped at the edge of the gravel. One man got out. He was not wearing a balaclava. He was not carrying a weapon anyone could see. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, no tie, and polished black shoes that had no business being at the end of a dirt track. He raised both hands, palms out. "My name is Gideon Thorne," he said. "I am an attorney. I am here to speak with Mr. Tanner on behalf of a client. I am not armed. I am not recording. I am here alone." Roy walked out of the shop. He stopped about 10 feet from Gideon Thorne. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Talk." Gideon Thorne lowered his hands slowly. "Mr. Tanner," he said, "my client has asked me to offer you $5 million in cash delivered within 48 hours in exchange for a single object currently in your possession. A small device, approximately the size of a thumb. We believe it was in the keepsakes left to the boy by his mother. We are prepared to be very generous and very respectful of the boy in this transaction. No harm would come to him. He would be free to remain with you. He would be free to live wherever he wishes. Our only interest is in the device." Roy looked at him. "There is no device," Roy said. Gideon Thorne did not blink. "Mr. Tanner." "There is no device," Roy said again. Gideon Thorne smiled politely. "My client will find that difficult to believe." "Then your client has a problem," Roy said. Gideon Thorne looked past Roy for the first time at the shop, at the boy who was standing just inside the doorway in his too big flannel shirt, at the 52 men in the yard who were all suddenly looking at Gideon Thorne. "Mr. Tanner," he said gently, "I am an intermediary. I am paid to convey messages. The message I am here to convey is this: my client does not stop. Not for money, not for time, not for sympathy. My client will come and come and come until the object in question is returned. You will at some point grow old. The boy will at some point need to go to a school or to a doctor or to a public place. And on that day, without fail, we will come." Roy was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Mr. Thorne, is your client currently in this country?" Gideon Thorne tilted his head slightly. "He is not," he said. Roy nodded. "I thought not," he said. "Then I have a message for your client in return. You tell him that the evidence he is looking for has been duplicated 4 times, mailed to 4 cities in 4 different states, and placed under the standing care of 4 attorneys, who are instructed to open the envelopes in the event of any unexplained injury or disappearance involving the boy, myself, the president of my chapter, or a newspaper man named Hollis Bream." Gideon Thorne's face did not change, but his eyes did slightly. "That is a dead man's bargain," he said quietly. "Yes, it is," Roy said. Gideon Thorne considered that for a long moment. "You know what you have done, Mr. Tanner." "I know exactly what I have done," Roy said. Gideon Thorne inclined his head, the smallest possible bow, the courteous gesture of a professional, acknowledging that an opposing professional had played an unexpectedly strong hand. "I will convey your message," he said, "faithfully." He got back into the silver sedan. He turned it around in the gravel. He drove back down the dirt track slowly and was gone. Roy stood in the yard and watched the dust of the sedan settle out of the air. Caleb came out of the shop and stood beside him. He looked up at Roy. "He is not going to come back," Caleb said. "No," Roy said. "He is not. He is not going to send anyone else." "No," Roy said. "Not unless something bad happens to one of us. And then a lot of other people go down with us. He knows that now." Caleb considered that. "Uncle Roy," he said, "yes, we win." Roy looked down at him. No, son, he said quietly, we do not win. Your mother won. She won the day she taught you the game. We just finished carrying it for her. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then with his small hand he reached up and took hold of two of Roy's thick calloused fingers. He did not say anything else. He did not have to. That night, after the 52 bikes had settled into a loose camp in the pines around the shop, and the smoke from a small cook fire was drifting up through the branches, Caleb came and sat down across from Roy on an overturned wooden crate. He had the leather pouch in his hands. He looked at Roy for a long moment. "Uncle Roy," he said. "Yes, son," my mother said, "that I had to give this to somebody safe. I think she meant you." Roy looked at the pouch in the boy's small hands. He set down his coffee. "Son," he said, "you do not have to give it to anybody. That pouch is yours." Caleb shook his head. "I want to open it. With you. Before I am any older. Before I forget why my mother gave it to me." Roy looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded once. Caleb worked his small fingers along the inside seam. The thread Lorene had noticed came apart easily under his nails the way a stitch does when it has been sewn by somebody who wanted it to be found one day. He tipped the pouch over into Roy's big open palm. 3 things fell out. The first was a folded square of newspaper yellowed with age. Roy opened it carefully, the way a man opens a letter from a woman he has not spoken to in 40 years. It was a clipping from the early 80s. A photograph of a younger man with dark hair and a heavy beard standing next to a black Harley outside of a shop Roy recognized, because the shop was the one whose roof was sheltering them tonight. The caption under the photograph read, "Only Renner best hands on the West Coast." "Bishop," Roy said quietly. The second thing was a small round cloth patch, faded, hand-stitched. The kind of patch a man received only once in his life on the night his brothers decided he was no longer a prospect. Roy held it between 2 thick fingers, careful like a religious object. The thread had gone soft with time. The colors had gone dim, but the shape was unmistakable. It was Bishop's original patch, from the year he had been voted in, kept all this time by a daughter who had left a funeral at 19 and never looked back. The third thing was a folded piece of lined paper, a note, written in a tight, careful hand. 9 years old. 10, maybe. Caleb took it out himself. He unfolded it slowly. He did not read it out loud. He had never been taught to read out loud, and he was not sure he could keep his voice flat for what was on it. He handed it to Roy. Roy held it up to the firelight. The note said, "If anyone is reading this, my name is Marin Renner, and I have a son. His name is Caleb. He is mine, and he is my father's, and he is yours. If I am gone and he is still walking, find him a brother named Roy Tanner. My father told me once, if you ever need a man who will not ask questions and will not stop, that is the name. I have spent 3 years teaching my boy how to remember and how to be quiet and how to run. In the 4th year, I taught him where. There is a station at the edge of the desert called the Sinclair. A man stops there most Tuesdays. Watch for him, Caleb. When you see him, let him see you. That is all you have to do." Roy held the note for a long time. He did not speak. After a while he folded it carefully along the old creases. He laid the patch on top of it. He laid the newspaper clipping on top of the patch. He slid all three things back inside the pouch, and he handed the pouch back to Caleb. "Son," he said. "Yes, Uncle Roy. Your mother did not find me by accident 3 months ago. The convenience store, the protein bars, she had pointed you at me. She had been pointing you at me from the night she started the game." Caleb nodded. "I know," he said quietly. "I have known since the first time I saw your face." Roy looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me, son?" Caleb's small hand tightened around the pouch. "Because," she said, "that if I told you too soon, you would think you owed me, and she did not want you to save me because you owed me. She wanted you to save me because you saw me." Roy closed his eyes. For a long moment he did not open them. When he did, his voice was rough and very low. "I saw you, son," he said, "the first second. Before I knew a single thing about you, I saw you." Caleb reached across the crate. He took hold of two of Roy's thick, calloused fingers the way a boy holds a rope on a cliff. He held them. Around the clearing, the 52 men of the Oakland Charter were quiet out of respect because men of that generation had learned a long time ago to recognize the sound of a child finally putting something heavy down. The fire popped once in the dark, and the pouch for the first time in 10 years hung open on its thong light at last around the neck of a boy who no longer had to carry it alone. 2 weeks later, the Bakersfield Herald, a newspaper of declining circulation and stubbornly loyal readership, ran a front-page story by Hollis Bream under the headline, "Years of Evidence Point to County District Attorney in Scheme with Foreign Trafficking Network." The story did not name a 10-year-old minor. The story referenced carefully a sealed cooperating witness in protective arrangement. The story contained 37 corroborated names, 14 addresses, and a series of bank records that federal investigators had independently been quietly developing for 16 months and had been lacking only a single honest human mouth to open the door. Emmett Vaughn was arrested on a Thursday on the steps of the county courthouse in a charcoal gray suit by two federal marshals who did not smile. He was not yet on trial, but his trial everyone understood would not end the way his last 20 years had ended. 3 weeks after that, the back cover of the same newspaper ran a much smaller item. An attorney from a firm in San Francisco had filed the necessary paperwork on behalf of the minor heir of the late Marin Renner, formally transferring guardianship of the minor and access to a private trust of approximately $4 million to one Roy H. Tanner of the unincorporated county. The amount of the trust was not disclosed in the paper, but a quiet envelope was delivered the same week to the owner of a diner in Bakersfield, which covered the cost of every renovation she had ever put off. Marlene Koski read the envelope, sat down at her own counter, and cried for 10 minutes into a dish towel. Then she stood up, washed her face, and went back to work. Her son Tobias started calling Caleb his brother without asking anyone. Nobody corrected him. The shop reopened that fall. Roy hired 2 brothers from the chapter and an older mechanic named Orrin who had worked under Bishop back in the 70s. They cleaned the dust out of the rafters. They rehung the signs. They swept the concrete floor and poured new epoxy on it. Over the main workbench above the tools, Orrin mounted a small framed photograph he had kept in a drawer for 19 years. It was a black and white shot of Bishop Renner in his 30s, leaning over the fender of a chopper holding a wrench, laughing at something somebody had just said. Caleb stood in front of that photograph for a long time the first day it went up. He did not speak. He reached up slowly and rested his small hand on the frame. The first thing Roy taught him was how to check the oil. The second thing was how to torque a valve cover bolt. The third thing was how to sit quietly next to a grown man for 4 hours without either one of them needing to say a single word. Caleb was good at all three. He lived officially in a small rebuilt house at the edge of town that Roy had bought quietly with a piece of the trust. It had a bedroom for Caleb with a door that locked from the inside. Roy had made sure of that before they moved in. Caleb checked the lock the first night 11 times. Roy did not comment. Roy had sat in the hallway, his back against the wall, until the boy fell asleep, just as he had done the first night at the clubhouse. On the second night, Caleb checked the lock 7 times. On the fifth night, 3. On the 14th night, the house was quiet. Roy was sitting at the kitchen table cleaning his coffee mug when he heard from the living room a small sound. He walked in. Caleb had fallen asleep on the couch with a motorcycle magazine open across his chest. Roy sat down carefully beside him. After a moment, Caleb, still asleep, shifted, and his small hand slid down from his chest and closed in a sleepy, unconscious grip around 2 of Roy's thick fingers. Roy Tanner, the man who for 40 years had been called Bone Crusher by other men who had meant the name, did not move for the next 6 hours. He did not move because he did not want to wake the boy. He did not move because his eyes against everything he thought he still knew about himself had filled all the way up, and he did not want to make a sound. Once a week, Caleb and Roy took their bikes out to Bishop's grave. It was in a small cemetery at the edge of the valley with a view of the long ridgeline to the east. Bishop's headstone was flat granite. It said his given name and his dates, and underneath in smaller letters the word Ryder. The first time they went, Caleb stood at the headstone for a very long time. He did not speak. Roy did not interrupt him. After a while, Caleb reached into his jacket and pulled out a small toy motorcycle, the kind that came in blister packs at truck stops for 99 cents, and he set it on top of the granite. He straightened it carefully so the front wheel pointed west. Roy had been placing a different small toy motorcycle on another headstone in another cemetery on the 14th of March every year for 19 years. He had not told Caleb about that ritual. He had not needed to. Caleb had understood somehow on his own. They did not go every 14th of March. They went the first Sunday of every month. On Caleb's 11th birthday, the diner in Bakersfield closed its doors for a private party. Marlene had strung paper lanterns along the ceiling. Tobias had blown up more balloons than were strictly reasonable. Lorene had come down from the valley bringing a pot of the same beef stew she had set in front of Caleb the first night he had ever eaten a hot meal under a roof that was going to stay over his head. Out in the parking lot there were motorcycles. There were not a few. There were 317. They had come from every chapter between San Diego and the Canadian border. Some of them had ridden for 3 days to get there. They did not most of them come inside. They stood around their bikes in the parking lot, talking quietly, drinking coffee Marlene had sent out in thermoses. Preacher was there, the Colonel was there, Grizzly and Moose were there, Hollis Bream in a thin suit was there holding a plate of pie with both hands like a man who had been told to sit down and eat something for once. Inside the diner at the center of the long table, Caleb sat on a chair with a phone book under him to bring him up to counter height. At the end of the meal, Roy stood up. He walked around the table to where Caleb was sitting. In his hands, he was carrying something wrapped in a folded piece of old black cloth. The cloth was older than Caleb. He set it down on the counter in front of the boy. "Son," he said. "Yes, Uncle Roy, this is yours. It was your grandfather's. A brother of mine held it for him after he passed. I had it cleaned and the stitching redone this month. I did not buy it for you. It was already yours. I am just handing it back." Caleb with both small hands unfolded the cloth. Inside was a leather biker's vest, well worn, soft. The hide had gone dark with age, where a man's sweat and the seasons had worked it. On the front over the left breast was a small embroidered patch with the letter B above a pair of crossed wrenches. On the back, sewn in heavy thread, was the name, Bishop. Caleb stared at the vest for a long moment. He did not say anything. He did not reach for it. Roy spoke quietly. "You do not have to wear it, Caleb. You do not have to put it on today. You do not have to put it on next year. It is yours whenever you are ready. You are too small for it right now, and that is all right. You are going to grow. It will fit when it fits. And if it never fits, that is all right too. It is yours either way." Caleb looked up at him, those slate-gray eyes steadier now than they had been a year ago. "Uncle Roy." "Yes, son." "Can I put it on the back of my chair?" "Yes, you can, son." Caleb carefully with both hands lifted the vest. He turned to his chair. He draped the old leather across the back of it. He smoothed the shoulders with his small palms. He made sure with the particular precision he had inherited from his mother that the name Bishop was centered. Then he sat back down. He picked up his spoon. He resumed eating his stew. Around the table nobody spoke for a long moment. Preacher cleared his throat. "Welcome home, son," he said. That was all. That was enough. Later, when it was almost dark, Caleb asked Roy if they could go for a ride. The parking lot had mostly emptied. 317 bikes had thundered off into the evening in pairs and in threes, carrying old men in leather back to their own homes in their own towns, where most of them had their own quiet grief hung up on the back of their own chairs. Roy wheeled the big Harley out of the lot. Caleb climbed up behind him. He wore a helmet now. He was big enough finally to see over Roy's shoulder instead of just pressing his face between Roy's shoulder blades. They rode out past the diner. They rode out past the last streetlight. They rode along the old highway that led up toward the foothills on the same road Roy had driven in a silent sedan a year before with a sleeping boy in the passenger seat, and the engines of a distant brotherhood just beginning to wake up across the valley. They did not ride fast. Roy kept the Harley in third gear. He let the evening come to them. At a pullout halfway up the ridge, Roy eased over to the side of the road. He put his feet down. He killed the engine. Below them the valley lay in a soft, dusty gold. The lights of Bakersfield were just coming on. Far to the east the Sierra was turning a deep blue. Caleb did not get off the bike. He stayed behind Roy, his small hands flat against the back of Roy's vest, his head resting between Roy's shoulder blades, his cheek against the worn leather. They sat that way for a long time. After a while, without moving, Caleb spoke. "Uncle Roy." "Yes, son. I am not running any more." "I know, son." Caleb was quiet. Then he said, "Neither are you." Roy put his big, rough hand back over one of Caleb's small hands where it rested against his vest and held it there. "No, son," he said. "Neither am I." They did not speak again. Below them the valley finished turning to evening. Somewhere far across that valley, in another town, in another yard, an old man was getting off a motorcycle and walking slowly toward his own porch where a light was on for him. And in another town past that one, another old man was doing the same thing. And in another town past that one, another one. 317 men quietly going home, a boy and an old biker on a ridge watching them go. A name on a forearm and a name on the back of a chair at a diner counter and a name on a flat granite headstone at the edge of the valley. And underneath all of it, carried on the wind, the low, far-off rolling sound of engines that had learned over a lifetime that the best thing an engine can do for a boy who has been hunted at the end of a long, hard road is simply to go quiet and let him rest.